Hello there, and welcome to my paint guide for the Hello There squad pack for Star Wars Shatterpoint. As you can see, the very first thing I did before we start anything was give all 4 models a spray with some matte white from Colourforge. First thing I'm going to do is use some Abaddon Black to paint in the gaps between the armour. If you're unsure of where to paint these, just have a quick look for some reference material. Then all 4 miniatures were given a wash with a mix of contrast medium and basil Canum grey. It's about a 70-30 mix. We want to keep the grey as subtle as possible, so that will help make the white shine a little bit later on. Next, I'm going to use some matte white that I've thinned down a little bit to make the transition from the grey to the white as smooth as possible. I'm going to do a couple of coats for each highlight, that way the white is also a lot sharper. With the white out of the way, I'm going to move back to the black, and I'm going to use Corvus Black to start highlighting the areas on the actual suit. Then I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey for the next highlight. And then finally Eshin Grey just by itself for the final highlight. For the weapons, I'm going to use some Eshin Grey for the first edge highlight. Then I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Mechanica Standard Grey and Eshin Grey for the second and final highlight. I'm then going to use Morghast Bone to start painting in the cloth on Obi-Wan. And this will be given a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. While that dries, I'm going to start painting in the yellow on Cody and the Clone Troopers. I'm going to use Avalanche Sunset for this. If you're unsure where to paint, there's plenty of pictures knocking around on the internet you can use for reference. Next up is a little bit of a tricky part that you can skip if you wish. I'm going to use some Corvus Black to mark in the areas where the white and the yellow mix. Be very careful with this and make sure you use a very thin tipped brush. With that out of the way, I'm now going to use some Cassandora yellow to shade all the areas that we've just painted yellow. While that dries, we're going to move back to Obi-Wan's clothing. I'm going to relayer the area again with Morghast Bone, avoiding all the recesses where we've put the shade. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Ushabti Bone and Morghast Bone. Then Ushabti Bone just by itself for the next layer. Then a 50-50 mix of Screaming Skull and Ushabti Bone. And lastly, Screaming Skull just by itself. I'm then going to paint his belt with some Dryad bark. Which will be given a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, we're going to move back and finish off the yellow, so I'm going to use Avalanche Sunset again to start the edge highlighting. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Dawn Yellow. Moving back to Obi-Wan's belt, I'll do a 50-50 mix of Dryad Bark and Baneblade Brown. And for the second highlight, we'll add a little bit more of the Baneblade Brown to the mix, creating a 30-70 split in favour of Baneblade Brown. Now it's time to paint the flesh on both Cody and Obi-Wan, and that'll get a coat of Bugman's Glow, followed by a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. While that dries, it's time to paint some metal areas, so I'll use Iron Hand Steel to paint all those areas in. There's a bit on Cody's backpack that I'm going to paint, as well as Obi-Wan's lightsaber and this tiny little bit on his belt. All these areas will then get a wash with some Nuln Oil. Obi-Wan has a red badge on one of his shoulders, so we're going to paint that in using Mephiston Red. And that'll be highlighted with some Evil Sunz Scarlet. All of this will give plenty of time for the wash on the face to dry, so I'm going to start putting in the eyes with some Abaddon Black, followed by matte white, and then back to Abaddon Black for the pupils. I'm then going to start painting the skin with a mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone for a 50-50 mix, followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. This is as far as we're going to go with Cody, but Obi-Wan's skin is slightly lighter, so we're going to mix in some Kislev Flesh to the Cadian Flesh Tone for a 50-50 mix for the next highlight, followed by Kislev Flesh just by itself. I'm then going to use Dryad Bark to paint Cody's hair, which I'll give a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. Obi-Wan's hair is a slightly lighter brown, so I'm going to use some Mournfang brown for that and his beard. And that will receive a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. I'll then highlight the metal areas with some Stormhost Silver. Obi-Wan's lightsaber is then going to get a coat with some Temple Guard Blue. I'll then use some Barhoff Blue for the first edge highlight. And that will be followed by a mix of Barhoff Blue and Matte White for a 50-50 mix for the second and final. Now it's time to get the bases out of the way, so we're going to use some XV88 to paint the muddy areas and the rocks on the bases. Some Dawnstone Grey on the concrete and the rubble in front of Obi-Wan's feet, which will then be edge highlighted with some Grey Sear. And we'll edge highlight the muddy areas with some Tau Light Ochre. Then we're going to paint the rims on the base with some Abaddon Black. And finally, we'll use some Agrax Earthshade watered down to wash the entire base. And that's the Hello There squad pack finished. I really enjoyed painting these guys, even though there's a lot of white, but if you take your time and just be careful, the white's perfectly easy to do. It only took about 6 hours to paint these guys. Once again, Atomic Mass knock it out of the park with their models. Absolutely fun to paint, really beautiful finishes as well. I hope you enjoyed this guide. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, give us a subscribe and a thumbs up, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.